Humanitarian assistance for North Korea appears to be in the works. South Korean President Moon Jae-in met with David Beasley, the executive director of the World Food Program, to share views on North Korea's food shortages and discuss ways to provide assistance. Today we go in depth through the progress on Seoul's food aid plans so far. And for that, Dr. Myong-hyun, a research fellow from the Asan Institute for Policy Studies, joins us in the studio today. Good to see you again.
Thanks for having me.
So despite North Korea's firing of short-range missiles into the East Sea last week, it seems that the South Korean government is still firm in its stance to provide food assistance to North Korea. Before we get started, can you run us through Seoul's intentions first?
Well, clearly, I think Seoul's intention here is pretty clear. I mean, there's a diplomatic purpose, but also there's a real need for humanitarian assistance in North Korea right now. We know from the reports from the United Nations agencies such as FAO and the WFP, World Food Program, and then Food and Agricultural Organizations, they have reported that North Korea suffered from a major production shortfall in grain production because of the dry conditions last year. So that the size of the shortfall is around 1.5 million tons of grain. And I mean, I think the South Korean government is clearly feels responsible to satisfy the humanitarian need. So there's no political purpose there in per se. But at the same time, I believe the South Korean government would like to use this crisis, quote unquote, as an opportunity to move ahead with the stalled dialogue between the two Koreas. We know that after the collapse of the Hanoi summit, South Korean President Moon Jae-in essentially self-appointed as an intermediary between Washington and Pyongyang to push forward with the negotiation of denuclearization. We know that the North Korean reaction to that has been pretty negative. I mean, they criticized South Korea for being a bystander rather than being proactive in, quote-unquote, helping North Korea to convince Washington to change American negotiation tactics. So in that sense, I think the South Korean government would like to use this chance as a way to restart the dialogue between Pyongyang and Seoul.
So it has a lot of positive reasons, but a recent opinion poll shows that people are largely divided over the issue. It shows that 46% of people are in favor of providing food assistance to North Korea, while 50% are actually against the idea. Now, the government says it will first get public assistance on the matter before pushing through, but do you think it will require a fair bit of persuasion at this point?
Well, the polling results, first of all, is a little bit surprising. I mean, the South Korean public has been pretty open-minded about separating humanitarian issues from political issues. I believe the poll results is leaning on the opposition side to restarting the humanitarian assistance because of the North Korea's late provocations that we experienced the last couple of weeks. But then in the long run, I believe the South Korean public is probably disposed to increase the level of humanitarian assistance to North Korea. And I'm sure that the South Korean government knows that. So I think with a little bit of careful planning and then with right timing, I believe the South Korean government will be able to convince the public of restarting a major scale humanitarian assistance to Pyongyang.
So like you said, the South Korean government has stressed that the issue of providing food assistance should be separated with political issues. Do you think it's possible to separate the two, though?
Well, that's a tricky part when it comes to North Korea. Where, I mean, in the technical sense, the economic situation in North Korea is quite different from South Korea, or for that matter, from the rest of the world. For instance, rice, which is a major staple for both Koreas for food consumption, can be monetized in North Korea, whereas it doesn't get monetized in South Korea. So whereas South Korea and then most of the public, and including the international community, supports the idea of helping the needy in North Korea, I don't think not many people are willing to see the assistance being monetized for money and then end up in helping the regime and to further develop their nuclear capability. So because of this reason alone, it's difficult not to avoid the politicization of the humanitarian assistance in North Korea. So there are many different, I mean, not that many, but then there are some ways to avoid this controversy, such as by establishing very strong policies against the possible diversion of humanitarian aid. But then these are complicated process, and we need, in a way, cooperation from Pyongyang itself.
So if we recall back to 2017, the South Korean government actually approved a plan to provide $8 million worth of humanitarian assistance to North Korea, but obviously that plan was never put to action. Now, South Korea is pushing to send food assistance by no later than September of this year to help ease the worsening food shortages. How much and in what format do you think is the most appropriate?
Well, there are two ways to go about increasing the assistance in North Korea. One is use the direct route between Seoul and Pyongyang, which means that South Korea can provide the bulk of the assistance to North Korea directly. Say, I mean, if South Korea believes that North Korea is in need of major assistance in food, then South Korea can take the surplus rice production that we have in storage and provide it to North Korea. And we have antecedents for that. I mean, in the previous South Korean administrations have provided North Korea with up to 400,000 tons of rice per year. So it's possible that we can resume that amount of that scale of assistance again. But then that again hits the problem of diversion of aid and monetization of aid. And maybe that's the reason why maybe it's preferable to use the multilateral framework, meaning use the United Nations agencies that are already operating in North Korea. There's a large-scale presence of a UN food assistance programs already, and they have implemented, through experience of operating in North Korea, they have implemented an effective policies against diversion. For instance, they try not to provide food products that go directly to the vulnerable population. They provide nutritional supplements that are difficult to monetize through the market system. So in that sense, I think South Korean government should entertain the idea of using the United Nations route to provide assistance in North Korea.
So it is gathering opinions from experts as well on the matter. Now, staying with the topic, a North Korean propaganda media outlet has been critical of South Korea's plans to provide food assistance, saying that it's putting fundamental issues such as implementing the joint declarations between the two on the back burner. Now, do you think it's out of protest to Seoul's approach to put humanitarian assistance with denuclearization talks, or do you think it's trying to get South Korea to refrain from discussions on North Korea's dire food situation?
Well, there are actually the 2 points are pretty valid. I mean, North Korea is probably seeing the political aspect of the South Korean government's move to restart the humanitarian assistance. Instead of looking at the humanitarian side, probably North Korea is sensing that the Seoul is trying to use this opportunity to restart the inter-Korean dialogue. So maybe they're protesting against that idea because right now North Korea would like to focus 100% on convincing Washington to change its negotiation tactics towards North Korea. But at the same time, there's the propaganda, the ideological aspect to this too. The North Korean regime prides itself having achieved self-sufficiency in food production. As a matter of fact, North Korea expelled international NGOs that specifically was in North Korea to help North Korea's food situation already 10 years ago. So I think the North Korean regime definitely thinks that the South Korean government is reminding the international community that the regime has failed in the aspect of self-production, self-sufficiency in food production. So that's something that the North Korean government doesn't want to see.
Do you think by any chance North Korea may refuse to accept the food assistance from South Korea for any circumstances? That's
very possible. They already sent the message to Seoul that they're not going to accept direct assistance from Seoul. That's the reason why the United Nations route is probably politically more convenient for North Korea, because the UN agencies are already operating there, and then North Koreans apparently like the assistance provided through multilateral agencies, and it's depoliticized. So maybe that's the most effective route for now. But clearly, the South Korean government doesn't think that helps with the current policies of inter-Korean engagement.
Some are actually concerned at the fact that providing food aid to North Korea, despite its missile launches, may actually send kind of a wrong message to North Korea. What's your take on this?
Well, we're talking about food assistance. It falls under the category of humanitarian assistance. And I think there's a consensus among experts that Even despite the cycles of provocations carried out by North Korea, we have to keep the level of dialogue with Pyongyang, and the best way to do that is to maintain the level of humanitarian assistance to North Korea. So I think that's the reason why it's probably advisable for South Korea to insist in helping North Korea either bilaterally or multilaterally.
Now, amidst the discussions over the food assistance, acting U.S. Defense Secretary Patrick Shanahan says Washington remains focused on diplomacy to dismantle North Korea's nuclear weapons. Now, although its military will be prepared in the event if that falls through, the U.S. keeps stressing dialogue despite the short-range missile launches. Why do you think so?
Well, I think Washington is right now in a move for managing the situation in the Korean Peninsula rather than solving the problem for good. I mean, I think that President Trump has made it clear that, probably he feels that the time is on the American side rather than the North Korean side. So until North Korea comes with a better terms of negotiation, meaning North Korea willing to accept the unilateral denuclearization for itself, I think Washington will be in the standby mood. And then I think the United States understands that North Korea's latest provocations are a way for North Korea to somehow provoke the United States into responding actively, which they could precipitate a crisis in the Korean Peninsula, which will play into the North Korean hands. So I think Washington is trying to avoid that situation and keep the initiative on their side.
So despite North Korea playing some of its military cards, the situation hasn't really changed much or turned in their favor. In this case, what do you think could be the next potential move of North Korea? And do you possibly see further military action down the line?
That's definitely possible. I mean, provocation is the language that North Koreans speak best. And also it's a bit more, so far historically has shown to be the most effective means of eliciting reaction from Washington. So the fact that Washington is ignoring Pyongyang is creating actually increasing the chance that North Korea might engage next level of provocation. But at the same time, North Korea is likely to combine provocation with a diplomatic offer. It's likely that North Korea is preparing a major provocation down the road for later this year, but at the same time, they're going to make an offer to Washington about coming out different terms of negotiation about denuclearization, such as a new list of nuclear facilities that North Korea might be willing to disclose and shut down eventually in exchange for lifting of the sanctions. So we are going to see a two-pronged approach from Pyongyang, a diplomatic offensive and a military offensive, provocations.
So North Korea did say it will give the U.S. until the end of this year. Meanwhile, the foreign ministers of China and Russia also met in Sochi on Monday and expressed their will to actively participate in the denuclearization talks. Now, the two sides also agreed that they are prepared to give security guarantees to North Korea should it denuclearize. What do you think their intentions are?
Well, clearly, we know that from the meeting between Russian President Putin and Kim Jong-un in Vladivostok last month, it was clearly shown that Russia is opposed to the idea of recognizing North Korea as a nuclear state. And actually, that's the position held by China as well. So, but if that's the case, if the logical argument to that is that if you oppose the idea of North Korea becoming a nuclear state, but at the same time you don't want to see the United States attacking North Korea, for instance, then the China and Russia have to express the commitment to the idea of not recognizing North Korea as a nuclear state. And then the counterpart to that is that somebody will have to provide the security guarantee that the North Korea is willing to take in exchange for giving up its nuclear weapons. So right now, it's clear that China and Russia are also former allies of North Korea, and the friendly states of North Korea right now are best positioned to provide that guarantee, and also puts China and Russia again in the center of the action, in the diplomatic action in the Korean Peninsula, and takes the initiative away from Washington. So in that sense, it's a move by China and Russia to boost their influence in the Korean Peninsula.
Do you see any potential for multi-party talks on denuclearization in the near future, though?
Well, that's been rejected by both actually, that's been rejected by Washington. Washington sees the multilateral approach as a delaying tactic. So, but then at the same time, given that we have seen throughout this year that Washington and Pyongyang have been unable to build any level of a significant amount of trust, the only option left for now could be a multilateral approach. So it could be happening in the future, but then I think we have to go through another cycle of crisis to convince Washington the present approach is not working.
So the situation is pretty much at a standstill at this moment, but North Korea has meanwhile demanded the immediate return of a cargo seized by the U.S., calling the move an unlawful robbery. And if we recall last week, the U.S. accused Pyongyang of violating international sanctions by using the vessel for coal shipments. Now, some see the North's latest criticism against the U.S. As an indication of its anxiety to saying that the seizure could lead to actually Washington imposing further sanctions on North Korea. If that is the case, what could this mean for the denuclearization talks then?
Well, I think North Korea clearly takes the seizure of their vessel by the U.S. government as a provocation. I mean, clearly, the vessel has already been detained by Indonesia under the actions carried out by the United Nations Security Council resolution. So there's no immediate need for the U.S. government to ask the Indonesian government to hand over the North Korean vessel to the United States. So in that sense, North Koreans probably think this as an escalation of an amount of pressure from Washington applied on them. So their interpretation is probably right. I think U.S. government is preparing to increase the level of pressure on North Korea. And North Koreans clearly see that that's going to be the trend for the medium term at least. So that might actually lead to the speeding up of what North Koreans are thinking of doing right now, which is launching next round of provocations. So in that sense, you're right. I mean, North Korea might sense this, that pressure is going to be unrelenting, and therefore they have to respond fast.
So something we will have to keep our eyes on in the time to come. That's all the time we have for today. Thank you so much for your insights.
My pleasure.
And that does it for this edition of News in Depth. Join us again at the same time tomorrow. Thank you for watching and goodbye.